The Lives of the 12 Caesars. By Suetonius. D. Octavius Caesar Augustus. Part 1.
If you are returning to the Classic Masterworks channel, welcome back. If you are new, please don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the bell notification so that you will be made aware of our latest content. And now, on with the story.
That the family of the Octavii was of the first distinction in Vitellius is rendered evident by many circumstances. For in the most frequented part of the town, there was, not long since, a street named the Octavian, and an altar was to be seen, consecrated to one Octavius, who being chosen general in a war with some neighboring people, the enemy making a sudden attack, while he was sacrificing to Mars, he immediately snatched the entrails of the victim from off the fire, and offered them half raw upon the altar, after which, marching out to battle, he returned victorious. This incident gave rise to a law, by which it was enacted, that in all future times the entrails should be offered to Mars in the same manner, and the rest of the victim be carried to the Octavii. This family, as well as several in Rome, was admitted into the Senate by Tarquinius Priscus, and soon afterwards placed by Servius Tullius among the patricians, but in process of time it transferred itself to the plebeian order, and, after the lapse of a long interval, was restored by Julius Caesar to the rank of patricians. The first person of the family raised by the suffrages of the people to the magistracy was Caius Rufus. He obtained the quaestorship, and had two sons, Gnaeus and Caius, from whom are descended the two branches of the Octavian family, which have had very different fortunes. For Gnaeus, and his descendants in uninterrupted succession, held all the highest offices of the state, whilst Caius and his posterity, whether from their circumstances or their choice, remained in the equestrian order until the father of Augustus. The great-grandfather of Augustus served as a military tribune in the Second Punic War in Sicily, under the command of Aemilius Pappus. His grandfather contented himself with bearing the public offices of his own municipality, and grew old in the tranquil enjoyment of an ample patrimony. Such is the account given by different authors. Augustus himself, however, tells us nothing more than that he was descended of an equestrian family, both ancient and rich, of which his father was the first who obtained the rank of senator. Mark Antony upbraidingly tells him that his great-grandfather was a freedman of the territory of Thurium, and a rope-maker, and his grandfather a usurer. This is all the information I have anywhere met with, respecting the ancestors of Augustus by the father's side. His father Caius Octavius was, from his earliest years, a person both of opulence and distinction, for which reason I am surprised at those who say that he was a money dealer, and was employed in scattering bribes, and canvassing for the candidates at elections, in the Campus Martius. For being bred up in all the affluence of a great estate, he attained with ease to honourable posts, and discharged the duties of them with much distinction. After his praetorship, he obtained by lot the province of Macedonia, in his way to which he cut off some banditti, the relics of the armies of Spartacus and Catiline, who had possessed themselves of the territory of Thurium, having received from the Senate an extraordinary commission for that purpose. In his government of the province, he conducted himself with equal justice and resolution, for he defeated the Bessians and Thracians in a great battle, and treated the allies of the Republic in such a manner, that there are extant letters from M. Tullius Cicero, in which he advises and exhorts his brother Quintus, who then held the proconsulship of Asia with no great reputation, to imitate the example of his neighbour Octavius, in gaining the affections of the allies of Rome. After quitting Macedonia, before he could declare himself a candidate for the consulship, he died suddenly, leaving behind him a daughter, the elder Octavia, by Ancaria, and another daughter, Octavia the younger, as well as Augustus, by Asia, who was the daughter of Marcus Aetius Balbus, and Julia, sister to Caius Julius Caesar. Balbus was, by the father's side, of a family who were natives of Aricia, and many of whom had been in the Senate. By the mother's side he was nearly related to Pompey the Great, and after he had borne the office of praetor, was one of the 20 commissioners appointed by the Julian law to divide the land in Campania among the people. But Mark Antony, treating with contempt Augustus's descent even by the mother's side, says that his great-grandfather was of African descent, and at one time kept a perfumer's shop, and at another, a bakehouse, in Aricia. And Cassius of Parma, in a letter, taxes Augustus with being the son not only of a baker, but a usurer. These are his words: "Thou art a lump of thy mother's meal, which a moneychanger of Nerulum taking from the newest bakehouse of Aricia, kneaded into some shape, with his hands all discolored by the fingering of money." Augustus was born in the consulship of Marcus Tullius Cicero and Caius Antonius, upon the 9th of the calends of October, the road September, a little before sunrise, in the quarter of the Palatine Hill, and the street called the Oxheads, where now stands a chapel dedicated to him, and built a little after his death. For, as it is recorded in the proceedings of the Senate, when Caius Laetorius, a young man of a patrician family, in pleading before the senators for a lighter sentence, upon his being convicted of adultery, alleged, besides his youth and quality, that he was the possessor, and as it were the guardian, of the ground which the divine Augustus first touched upon his coming into the world, and entreated that he might find favor, for the sake of that deity, who was in a peculiar manner his. An act of the Senate was passed, for the consecration of that part of his house in which Augustus was born. His nursery is shown to this day, in a villa belonging to the family, in the suburbs of Velletri, being a very small place, and much like a pantry. An opinion prevails in the neighborhood, that he was also born there. Into this place no person presumes to enter, unless upon necessity, and with great devotion, from a belief, for a long time prevalent, that such as rashly enter it are seized with great horror and consternation, which a short while since was confirmed by a remarkable incident. For when a new inhabitant of the house had, either by mere chance, or to try the truth of the report, taken up his lodging in that apartment, in the course of the night, a few hours afterwards, he was thrown out by some sudden violence, he knew not how, and was found in a state of stupefaction, with the coverlid of his bed, before the door of the chamber. While he was yet an infant, the surname of Thurinus was given him, in memory of the birthplace of his family, or because, soon after he was born, his father Octavius had been successful against the fugitive slaves, in the country near Thurium. That he was surnamed Thurinus, I can affirm upon good foundation, for when a boy, I had a small bronze statue of him, with that name upon it in iron letters, nearly effaced by age, which I presented to the emperor, by whom it is now revered amongst the other tutelary deities in his chamber. He is also often called Thurinus contemptuously, by Mark Antony in his letters, to which he makes only this reply: "I am surprised that my former name should be made a subject of reproach." He afterwards assumed the name of Gaius Caesar, and then of Augustus, the former in compliance with the will of his great-uncle, and the latter upon a motion of Munatius Plancus in the Senate. For when some proposed to confer upon him the name of Romulus, as being, in a manner, a second founder of the city, it was resolved that he should rather be called Augustus, a surname not only new, but of more dignity, because places devoted to religion, and those in which anything is consecrated by augury, are denominated August, either from the word auctus, signifying augmentation, or ab avium gestu, gustuve, from the flight and feeding of birds, as appears from this verse of Ennius. When glorious Rome by August augury was built. He lost his father when he was only 4 years of age, and, in his 12th year, pronounced a funeral oration in praise of his grandmother Julia. 4 years afterwards, having assumed the robe of manhood, he was honored with several military rewards by Caesar in his African triumph, although he took no part in the war, on account of his youth. Upon his uncle's expedition to Spain against the sons of Pompey, he was followed by his nephew, although he was scarcely recovered from a dangerous sickness, and after being shipwrecked at sea, and traveling with very few attendants through roads that were infested with the enemy, he at last came up with him. This activity gave great satisfaction to his uncle, who soon conceived an increasing affection for him, on account of such indications of character. After the subjugation of Spain, while Caesar was meditating an expedition against the Dacians and Parthians, he was sent before him to Apollonia, where he applied himself to his studies, until receiving intelligence that his uncle was murdered, and that he was appointed his heir, he hesitated for some time whether he should call to his aid the legions stationed in the neighborhood, but he abandoned the design as rash and premature. However, returning to Rome, he took possession of his inheritance, although his mother was apprehensive that such a measure might be attended with danger, and his stepfather, Marcius Philippus, a man of consular rank, very earnestly dissuaded him from it. From this time, collecting together a strong military force, he first held the government in conjunction with Mark Antony and Marcus Lepidus, then with Antony only, for nearly 12 years, and at last in his own hands during a period of 44. Having thus given a very short summary of his life, I shall prosecute the several parts of it, not in order of time, but arranging his acts into distinct classes, for the sake of perspicuity. He was engaged in 5 civil wars, namely those of Modena, Philippi, Perugia, Sicily, and Actium, the first and last of which were against Antony, and the second against Brutus and Cassius, the third against Lucius Antonius, the triumvir's brother, and the fourth against Sextus Pompeius, the son of Gnaeus Pompeius. The motive which gave rise to all these wars was the opinion he entertained that both his honor and interest were concerned in revenging the murder of his uncle, and maintaining the state of affairs he had established. Immediately after his return from Apollonia, he formed the design of taking forcible and unexpected measures against Brutus and Cassius, but they having foreseen the danger and made their escape, he resolved to proceed against them by an appeal to the laws in their absence, and impeach them for the murder. In the meantime, those whose province it was to prepare the sports in honor of Caesar's last victory in the civil war, not daring to do it, he undertook it himself. And that he might carry into effect his other designs with greater authority, he declared himself a candidate in the room of a tribune of the people who happened to die at that time, although he was of a patrician family, and had not yet been in the Senate. But the consul, Mark Antony, from whom he had expected the greatest assistance, opposing him in his suit, and even refusing to do him so much as common justice, unless gratified with a large bribe, he went over to the party of the nobles, to whom he perceived Sylla to be odious, chiefly for endeavoring to drive Decius Brutus, whom he besieged in the town of Modena, out of the province, which had been given him by Caesar, and confirmed to him by the Senate. At the instigation of persons about him, he engaged some ruffians to murder his antagonist, but the plot being discovered, and dreading a similar attempt upon himself, he gained over Caesar's veteran soldiers, by distributing among them all the money he could collect. Being now commissioned by the Senate to command the troops he had gathered, with the rank of praetor, and in conjunction with Hirtius and Pansa, who had accepted the consulship, to carry assistance to Decius Brutus, he put an end to the war by 2 battles in 3 months. Antony writes, that in the former of these he ran away, and 2 days afterwards made his appearance without his general's cloak and his horse. In the last battle, however, it is certain that he performed the part not only of a general, but a soldier, for, in the heat of the battle, when the standard-bearer of his legion was severely wounded, he took the eagle upon his shoulders, and carried it a long time. In this war, Hirtius being slain in battle, and Pansa dying a short time afterwards of a wound, a report was circulated that they both were killed through his means, in order that, when Antony fled, the Republic having lost its consuls, he might have the victorious armies entirely at his own command. The death of Pansa was so fully believed to have been caused by undue means, that Glyco, his surgeon, was placed in custody, on a suspicion of having poisoned his wound. And to this, Aquilius Niger adds, that he killed Hirtius, the other consul, in the confusion of the battle, with his own hands. But upon intelligence that Antony, after his defeat, had been received by Marcus Lepidus, and that the rest of the generals and armies had all declared for the Senate, he, without any hesitation, deserted from the party of the nobles, alleging as an excuse for his conduct, the actions and sayings of several amongst them, for some said, he was a mere boy, and others threw out, that he ought to be promoted to honors, and cut off, to avoid the making any suitable acknowledgement either to him, or the veteran legions. And the more to testify his regret for having before attached himself to the other faction, he fined the Nursini in a large sum of money, which they were unable to pay, and then expelled them from the town, for having inscribed upon a monument, erected at the public charge to their countrymen who were slain in the Battle of Modena, that they fell in the cause of liberty. Having entered into a confederacy with Antony and Lepidus, he brought the war at Philippi to an end in 2 battles, although he was at that time weak, and suffering from sickness. In the first battle he was driven from his camp, and with some difficulty made his escape to the wing of the army commanded by Antony. And now, intoxicated with success, he sent the head of Brutus to be cast at the foot of Caesar's statue, and treated the most illustrious of the prisoners not only with cruelty, but with abusive language, insomuch that he is said to have answered one of them who humbly entreat that at least he might not remain unburied, that will be in the power of the birds. 2 others, father and son, who begged for their lives, he ordered to cast lots which of them should live, or settle it between themselves by the sword, and was a spectator of both their deaths, for the father offering his life to save his son, and being accordingly executed, the son likewise killed himself upon the spot. On this account, the rest of the prisoners, and amongst them Marcus Favonius, Cato's rival, being led up in fetters, after they had saluted Antony, the general, with much respect, reviled Octavius in the foulest language. After this victory, dividing between them the offices of the state, Mark Antony undertook to restore order in the east, while Caesar conducted the veteran soldiers back to Italy, and settled them in colonies on the lands belonging to the municipalities. But he had the misfortune to please neither the soldiers nor the owners of the lands, one party complaining of the injustice done them, in being violently ejected from their possessions, and the other, that they were not rewarded according to their merit. At this time he obliged Lucius Antony, who, presuming upon his own authority as consul, and his brother's power, was raising new commotions, to fly to Perugia, and forced him, by famine, to surrender at last, although not without having been exposed to great hazards, both before the war and during its continuance. For a common soldier having got into the seats of the equestrian order in the theatre, at the public spectacles, Caesar ordered him to be removed by an officer, and a rumour being thence spread by his enemies, that he had put the man to death by torture, the soldiers flocked together so much enraged, that he narrowly escaped with his life. The only thing that saved him, was the sudden appearance of the man, safe and sound, no violence having been offered him. And whilst he was sacrificing under the walls of Perugia, he nearly fell into the hands of a body of gladiators, who sallied out of the town. After the taking of Perugia, he sentenced a great number of the prisoners to death, making only one reply to all who implored pardon, or endeavored to excuse themselves: "You must die." Some authors write, that 300 of the 2 orders, selected from the rest, were slaughtered, like victims, before an altar raised to Julius Caesar, upon the Ides of March, th April. Nay, there are some who relate, that he entered upon the war with no other view, than that his secret enemies, and those whom fear more than affection kept quiet, might be detected, by declaring themselves, now they had an opportunity, with Lucius Antony at their head, and that having defeated them, and confiscated their estates, he might be enabled to fulfill his promises to the veteran soldiers. He soon commenced the Sicilian War, but it was protracted by various delays during a long period, at one time for the purpose of repairing his fleets, which he lost twice by storm, even in the summer, at another, while patching up a peace, to which he was forced by the clamours of the people, in consequence of a famine occasioned by Pompey's cutting off the supply of corn by sea. But at last, having built a new fleet, and obtained 20,000 manumitted slaves, who were given him for the oar, he formed the Julian harbour at Baiae, by letting the sea into the Lucrine and Avernian lakes, and having exercised his forces there during the whole winter, he defeated Pompey betwixt Mylae and Naulochus, although just as the engagement commenced, he suddenly fell into such a profound sleep, that his friends were obliged to wake him to give the signal. This, I suppose, gave occasion for Antony's reproach: "You were not able to take a clear view of the fleet, when drawn up in line of battle, but lay stupidly upon your back, gazing at the sky, nor did you get up and let your men see you, until Marcus Agrippa had forced the enemy's ships to sheer off." Others imputed to him both a saying and an action which were indefensible, for, upon the loss of his fleets by storm, He is reported to have said, "I will conquer in spite of Neptune," and at the next Ascension Games, he would not suffer the statue of that god to be carried in procession as usual. Indeed, he scarcely ever ran more or greater risks in any of his wars than in this. Having transported part of his army to Sicily, and being on his return for the rest, he was unexpectedly attacked by Demicles and Apollophanes, Pompey's admirals, from whom he escaped with great difficulty, and with one ship only. Likewise, as he was travelling on foot through the Locrian territory to Rhegium, seeing 2 of Pompey's vessels passing by that coast, and supposing them to be his own, he went down to the shore, and was very nearly taken prisoner. On this occasion, as he was making his escape by some byways, a slave belonging to Aemilius Paulus, who accompanied him, owing him a grudge for the proscription of Paulus, the father of Aemilius, and thinking he had now an opportunity of revenging it, attempted to assassinate him. After the defeat of Pompey, one of his colleagues, Marcus Lepidus, whom he had summoned to his aid from Africa, affecting great superiority, because he was at the head of 20 legions, and claiming for himself the principal management of affairs in a threatening manner, he divested him of his command, but, upon his humble submission, granted him his life, but banished him for life to Circe. The alliance between him and Antony, which had always been precarious, often interrupted, and ill-cemented by repeated reconciliations, he at last entirely dissolved. And to make it known to the world how far Antony had degenerated from patriotic feelings, he caused a will of his, which had been left at Rome, and in which he had nominated Cleopatra's children, amongst others, as his heirs, to be opened and read in an assembly of the people. Yet upon his being declared an enemy, he sent to him all his relations and friends, among whom were Gaius Suetonius and Titus Domitius, at that time consuls. He likewise spoke favorably in public of the people of Bologna, for joining in the association with the rest of Italy to support his cause, because they had, in former times, been under the protection of the family of the Antonii. And not long afterwards he defeated him in a naval engagement near Actium, which was prolonged to so late an hour, that, after the victory, he was obliged to sleep on board his ship. From Actium he went to the Isle of Samoa to winter, but being alarmed with the accounts of a mutiny amongst the soldiers he had selected from the main body of his army sent to Brundisium after the victory, who insisted on their being rewarded for their service and discharged, he returned to Italy. In his passage thither, he encountered 2 violent storms, the first between the promontories of Peloponnesus and Aetolia, and the other about the Ceraunian mountains, in both which a part of his Liburnian squadron was sunk, the spars and rigging of his own ship carried away, and the rudder broken in pieces. He remained only 27 days at Brundisium, until the demands of the soldiers were settled, and then went, by way of Asia and Syria, to Egypt, where laying siege to Alexandria, whither Antony had fled with Cleopatra, he made himself master of it in a short time. He drove Antony to kill himself, after he had used every effort to obtain conditions of peace, and he saw his corpse. Cleopatra he anxiously wished to save for his triumph, and when she was supposed to have been bit to death by an asp, he sent for the Scylla to endeavor to suck out the poison. He allowed them to be buried together in the same grave, and ordered a mausoleum, begun by themselves, to be completed. The eldest of Antony's 2 sons by Fulvia he commanded to be taken by force from the statue of Julius Caesar, to which he had fled, after many fruitless supplications for his life, and put him to death. The same fate attended Cesario, Cleopatra's son by Caesar, as he pretended, who had fled for his life, but was retaken. The children which Antony had by Cleopatra he saved, and brought up and cherished in a manner suitable to their rank, just as if they had been his own relations. At this time he had a desire to see the sarcophagus and body of Alexander the Great, which, for that purpose, were taken out of the cell in which they rested, and after viewing them for some time, he paid honors to the memory of that prince, by offering a golden crown, and scattering flowers upon the body. Being asked if he wished to see the tombs of the Ptolemies also, he replied, "I wish to see a king, not dead men." He reduced Egypt into the form of a province, and to render it more fertile, and more capable of supplying Rome with corn, he employed his army to scour the canals, into which the Nile, upon its rise, discharges itself, but which during a long series of years had become nearly choked up with mud. To perpetuate the glory of his victory at Actium, he built the city of Nicopolis on that part of the coast, and established games to be celebrated there every 5 years, enlarging likewise an old temple of Apollo. He ornamented with naval trophies the spot on which he had pitched his camp, and consecrated it to Neptune and Mars. He afterwards quashed several tumults and insurrections, as well as several conspiracies against his life, which were discovered, by the confession of accomplices, before they were ripe for execution, and others subsequently. Such were those of the younger Lepidus, of Varro Murena, and Fannius Scipio, then that of Marcus Ignatius, afterwards that of Plautius Rufus, and of Lucius Paulus, his granddaughter's husband, and besides these, another of Lucius Audacius, an old feeble man, who was under prosecution for forgery, as also of Asinius Epicadus, a Parthenian mongrel, and at last that of Telephus, a lady's prompter, for he was in danger of his life from the plots and conspiracies of some of the lowest of the people against him. Audacius and Epicadus had formed the design of carrying off to the armies his daughter Julia, and his grandson Agrippa, from the islands in which they were confined. Telephus, wildly dreaming that the government was destined to him by the fates, proposed to fall both upon Octavius and the Senate. Nay, once, a soldier's servant belonging to the army in Illyricum, having passed the porters unobserved, was found in the night time standing before his chamber door, armed with a hunting dagger. Whether the person was really disordered in the head, or only counterfeited madness, is uncertain, for no confession was obtained from him by torture. He conducted in person only 2 foreign wars, the Dalmatian, whilst he was yet but a youth, and, after Antony's final defeat, the Cantabrian. He was wounded in the former of these wars. In one battle he received a contusion in the right knee from a stone, and in another, he was much hurt in one leg and both arms, by the fall of a fridge. His other wars he carried on by his lieutenants, but occasionally visited the army, in some of the wars of Pannonia and Germany, or remained at no great distance, proceeding from Rome as far as Ravenna, Milan, or Aquileia. He conquered, however, partly in person, and partly by his lieutenants, Cantabria, Aquitania and Pannonia, Dalmatia, with all Illyricum and Rhaetia, besides the 2 Alpine nations, the Vindelici and the Salaci. He also checked the incursions of the Dacians, by cutting off 3 of their generals with vast armies, and drove the Germans beyond the river Elbe, removing 2 other tribes who submitted, the Ubi and Sicambri, into Gaul, and settling them in the country bordering on the Rhine. Other nations also, which broke into revolt, he reduced to submission. But he never made war upon any nation without just and necessary cause, and was so far from being ambitious either to extend the empire, or advance his own military glory, that he obliged the chiefs of some barbarous tribes to swear in the temple of Mars the Avenger, that they would faithfully observe their engagements, and not violate the peace which they had implored. Of some he demanded a new description of hostages, their women, having found from experience that they cared little for their men when given as hostages, but he always afforded them the means of getting back their hostages whenever they wished it. Even those who engaged most frequently and with the greatest perfidy in their rebellion, he never punished more severely than by selling their captives, on the terms of their not serving in any neighboring country, nor being released from their slavery before the expiration of 30 years. By the character which he thus acquired, for virtue and moderation, he induced even the Indians and Scythians, nations before known to the Romans by report only, to solicit his friendship, and that of the Roman people, by ambassadors. The Parthians readily allowed his claim to Armenia, restoring at his demand, the standards which they had taken from Marcus Crassus and Mark Antony, and offering him hostages besides. Afterwards, when a contest arose between several pretenders to the crown of that kingdom, they refused to acknowledge anyone who was not chosen by him. The temple of Janus Quirinus, which had been shut twice only, from the era of the building of the city to his own time, he closed thrice in a much shorter period, having established universal peace both by sea and land. He twice entered the city with the honors of an ovation, namely, after the War of Philippi, and again after that of Sicily. He had also 3 curule triumphs for his several victories in Dalmatia, at Actium, and Alexandria, each of which lasted 3 days. In all his wars, he never received any signal or ignominious defeat, except twice in Germany, under his lieutenants Lollius and Varus. The former indeed had in it more of dishonor than disaster, but that of Varus threatened the security of the empire itself, 3 legions, with the commander, his lieutenants, and all the auxiliaries, being cut off. Upon receiving intelligence of this disaster, he gave orders for keeping a strict watch over the city, to prevent any public disturbance, and prolonged the appointments of the prefects in the provinces, that the allies might be kept in order by experience of persons to whom they were used. He made a vow to celebrate the great games in honor of Jupiter, Optimus, Maximus, if he would be pleased to restore the state to more prosperous circumstances. This had formerly been resorted to in the Cimbrian and Marsian wars. In short, we are informed that he was in such consternation at this event, that he let the hair of his head and beard grow for several months, and sometimes knocked his head against the doorposts, crying out, "O, Quintilius Varus! Give me back my legions!" And ever after, he observed the anniversary of this calamity as a day of sorrow and mourning. In military affairs he made many alterations, introducing some practices entirely new, and reviving others, which had become obsolete. He maintained the strictest discipline among the troops, and would not allow even his lieutenants the liberty to visit their wives, except reluctantly, and in the winter season only. A Roman knight having cut off the thumbs of his 2 young sons, to render them incapable of serving in the wars, he exposed both him and his estate to public sale. But upon observing the farmers of the revenue very greedy for the purchase, he assigned him to a freedman of his own, that he might send him into the country, and suffer him to retain his freedom. The 10th legion becoming mutinous, he disbanded it with ignominy, and did the same by some others which petulantly demanded their discharge, withholding from them the rewards usually bestowed on those who had served their stated time in the wars. The cohorts which yielded their ground in time of action, he decimated, and fed with barley. Centurions, as well as common sentinels, who deserted their posts when on guard, he punished with death. For other misdemeanors he inflicted upon them various kinds of disgrace, such as obliging them to stand all day before the Praetorian, sometimes in their tunics only, and without their belts, sometimes to carry poles 10 feet long, or sods of turf. After the conclusion of the civil wars, he never, in any of his military harangues, or proclamations, addressed them by the title of fellow soldiers, but as soldiers only. Nor would he suffer them to be otherwise called by his sons or stepsons, when they were in command, judging the former epithet to convey the idea of a degree of condescension inconsistent with military discipline, the maintenance of order, and his own majesty, and that of his house. Unless at Rome, in case of incendiary fires, or under the apprehension of public disturbances during a scarcity of provisions, he never employed in his army slaves who had been made freedmen, except upon 2 occasions, on one, for the security of the colonies bordering upon Illyricum, and on the other, to guard the banks of the river Rhine. Although he obliged persons of fortune, both male and female, to give up their slaves, and they received their manumission at once, yet he kept them together under their own standard, unmixed with soldiers who were better born, and armed likewise after different fashion. Military rewards, such as trappings, collars, and other decorations of gold and silver, he distributed more readily than camp or mural crowns, which were reckoned more honorable than the former. These he bestowed sparingly, without partiality, and frequently even on common soldiers. He presented Agrippa, after the naval engagement in the Sicilian War, with a sea-green banner. Those who shared in the honors of a triumph, although they had attended him in his expeditions, and taken part in his victories, he judged it improper to distinguish by the usual rewards for service, because they had a right themselves to grant such rewards to whom they pleased. He thought nothing more derogatory to the character of an accomplished general than precipitancy and rashness, on which account he had frequently in his mouth those proverbs: "Spewed bradios hasten slowly," and Asphiles gar est amanen, ha irasus strata elites. The cautious captain's better than the bold. And, that is done fast enough, which is done well enough. He was wont to say also, that a battle or a war ought never to be undertaken, unless the prospect of gain overbalanced the fear of loss. For, said he, men who pursue small advantages with no small hazard, resemble those who fish with a golden hook, the loss of which, if the line should happen to break, could never be compensated by all the fish they might take. He was advanced to public offices before the age at which he was legally qualified for them, and to some, also, of a new kind, and for life. He seized the consulship in the 20th year of his age, quartering his legions in a threatening manner near the city, and sending deputies to demand it for him in the name of the army. When the Senate demurred, a centurion, named Cornelius, who was at the head of the chief deputation, throwing back his cloak, and showing the hilt of his sword, had the presumption to say in the Senate house, "This will make him consul, if he will not." His second consulship he filled 9 years afterwards, his third, after the interval of only 1 year, and held the same office every year successively until the 11th. From this period, although the consulship was frequently offered him, he always declined it, until, after a long interval, not less than 17 years, he voluntarily stood for the 12th, and 2 years after that, for a 13th, that he might successively introduce into the forum, on their entering public life, his 2 sons, Caius and Lucius, while he was invested with the highest office in the state. In his 5 consulships from the 6th to the 11th, he continued in office throughout the year, but in the rest, during only 9, 6, 4, or 3 months, and in his second no more than a few hours. For having sat for a short time in the morning, upon the calends of January, January, in his curule chair, before the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus, he abdicated the office, and substituted another in his room. Nor did he enter upon them all at Rome, but upon the 4th in Asia, the 5th in the Isle of Samos, and the 8th and 9th at Tarragona. During 10 years he acted as one of the triumvirate for settling the Commonwealth, in which office he for some time opposed his colleagues in their design of a proscription, but after it was begun, he prosecuted it with more determined rigor than either of them. For whilst they were often prevailed upon, by the interest and intercession of friends, to show mercy, he alone strongly insisted that no one should be spared, and even prescribed Caius Tyrrhenius, his guardian, who had been formerly the colleague of his father Octavius in the aedileship. Julius Suetonius adds this farther account of him, that when, after the proscription was over, Marcus Lepidus made an apology in the Senate for their past proceedings, and gave them hopes of a more mild administration for the future, because they had now sufficiently crushed their enemies, he, on the other hand, declared that the only limit he had fixed to the proscription was, that he should be free to act as he pleased. Afterwards, however, repenting of his severity, he advanced T. Vinus Philippomen to the equestrian rank, for having concealed his patron at the time he was proscribed. In this same office he incurred great odium upon many accounts. For as he was one day making an harangue, observing among the soldiers Pinarius, a Roman knight, admit some private citizens, and engaged in taking notes, he ordered him to be stabbed before his eyes, as a busybody and a spy upon him. He so terrified with his menaces Tedius Afer, the consul-elect, for having reflected upon some action of his, that he threw himself from a great height, and died on the spot. And when Quintus Gallius, the praetor, came to compliment him with a double tablet under his cloak, suspecting that it was a sword he had concealed, and yet not venturing to make a search, lest it should be found to be something else, he caused him to be dragged from his tribunal by centurions and soldiers, and tortured like a slave, and although he made no confession, ordered him to be put to death, after he had, with his own hands, plucked out his eyes. His own account of the matter, however, is, that Quintus Gallius sought a private conference with him, for the purpose of assassinating him, that he therefore put him in prison, but afterwards released him, and banished him the city, when he perished either in a storm at sea, or by falling into the hands of robbers. He accepted of the tribunician power for life, but more than once chose a colleague in that office for 2 lustra successively. He also had the supervision of morality and observance of the laws, for life, but without the title of censor, yet he thrice took a census of the people, the first and third time with a colleague, but the second by himself. He twice entertained thoughts of restoring the Republic, first, immediately after he had crushed Antony, remembering that he had often charged him with being the obstacle to its restoration. The second time was in consequence of a long illness, when he sent for the magistrates and the Senate to his own house, and delivered them a particular account of the state of the empire. But reflecting at the same time that it would be both hazardous to himself to return to the condition of a private person, and might be dangerous to the public to have the government placed again under the control of the people, he resolved to keep it in his own hands, whether with the better event or intention, is hard to say. His good intentions he often affirmed in private discourse, and also published an edict, in which it was declared in the following terms: "May it be permitted me to have the happiness of establishing the Commonwealth on a safe and sound basis, and thus enjoy the reward of which I am ambitious, that of being celebrated for moulding it into the form best adapted to present circumstances, so that, on my leaving the world, I may carry with me the hope that the foundations which I have laid for its future government will stand firm and stable." The city, which was not built in a manner suitable to the grandeur of the empire, and was liable to inundations of the Tiber, as well as to fires, was so much improved under his administration, that he boasted, not without reason, that he found it of brick, but left it of marble. He also rendered it secure for the time to come against such disasters, as far as could be effected by human foresight. A great number of public buildings were erected by him, the most considerable of which were a forum, containing the Temple of Mars the Avenger, the Temple of Apollo on the Palatine Hill, and the Temple of Jupiter Tonans in the Capitol. The reason of his building a new forum was the vast increase in the population, and the number of causes to be tried in the courts, for which, the two already existing not affording sufficient space, it was thought necessary to have a third. It was therefore opened for public use before the Temple of Mars was completely finished, and a law was passed, that causes should be tried, and judges chosen by lot, in that place. The Temple of Mars was built in fulfillment of a vow made during the War of Philippi, undertaken by him to avenge his father's murder. He ordained that the Senate should always assemble there when they met to deliberate respecting wars and triumphs, that thence should be dispatched all those who were sent into the provinces in the command of armies, and that in it those who returned victorious from the wars, should lodge the trophies of their triumphs. He erected the Temple of Apollo in that part of his house on the Palatine Hill which had been struck with lightning, and which, on that account, the soothsayers declared the god to have chosen. He added porticos to it, with a library of Latin and Greek authors, and when advanced in years, used frequently there to hold the Senate, and examine the rolls of the judges. He dedicated the temple to Apollo Tonans, in acknowledgement of his escape from a great danger in his Cantabrian expedition, when, as he was traveling in the night, his litter was struck by lightning, which killed the slave who carried a torch before him. He likewise constructed some public buildings in the name of others, for instance, his grandsons, his wife, and sister. Thus he built the portico and basilica of Lucius and Caius, and the porticos of Livia and Octavia, and the theatre of Marcellus. He also often exhorted other persons of rank to embellish the city by new buildings, or repairing and improving the old, according to their means. In consequence of this recommendation, many were raised, such as the Temple of Hercules and the Muses, by Marcius Philippus, a Temple of Diana by Lucius Cornificius, the Court of Freedom by Asinius Pollio, a Temple of Saturn by Munatius Plancus, a theatre by Cornelius Balbus, an amphitheatre by Statilius Taurus, and several other noble edifices by Marcus Agrippa. He divided the city into regions and districts, ordaining that the annual magistrates should take by lot the charge of the former, and that the latter should be superintended by wardens chosen out of the people of each neighborhood. He appointed a nightly watch to be on their guard against accidents from fire, and, to prevent the frequent inundations, he widened and cleansed the bed of the Tiber, which had in the course of years been almost dammed up with rubbish, and the channel narrowed by the ruins of houses. To render the approaches to the city more commodious, he took upon himself the charge of repairing the Flaminian Way as far as Ariminum, and distributed the repairs of the other roads amongst several persons who had obtained the honor of a triumph, to be defrayed out of the money arising from the spoils of war. Temples decayed by time, or destroyed by fire, he either repaired or rebuilt, and enriched them, as well as many others, with splendid offerings. On a single occasion, he deposited in the cell of the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus 16,000 pounds of gold, with jewels and pearls to the amount of 50 millions of sesterces. The office of Pontifex Maximus, of which he could not decently deprive Lepidus as long as he lived, he assumed as soon as he was dead. He then caused all prophetical books, both in Latin and Greek, the authors of which were either unknown, or of no great authority, to be brought in, and the whole collection, amounting to upwards of 2,000 volumes, he committed to the flames, preserving only the Sibylline oracles, but not even those without a strict examination, to ascertain which were genuine. This being done, he deposited them in 2 gilt coffers, under the pedestal of the statue of the Palatine Apollo. He restored the calendar, which had been corrected by Julius Caesar, but through negligence was again fallen into confusion, to its former regularity, and upon that occasion, called the month Sextilis, by his own name, August, rather than September, in which he was born, because in it he had obtained his first consulship, and all his most considerable victories. He increased the number, dignity, and revenues of the priests, and especially those of the Vestal Virgins. And when, upon the death of one of them, a new one was to be taken, and many persons made interest that their daughters' names might be omitted in the lists for election, he replied with an oath, "If either of my own granddaughters were old enough, I would have proposed her." He likewise revived some old religious customs, which had become obsolete, as the augury of public health, the office of High Priest of Jupiter, the religious solemnity of the Lupercalia, with the secular and Compitalian games. He prohibited young boys from running in the Lupercalia, and in respect of the secular games, issued an order that no young persons of either sex should appear at any public diversions in the night-time, unless in the company of some elderly relation. He ordered the household gods to be decked twice a year with spring and summer flowers, in the Compitalian festival. Next to the immortal gods, he paid the highest honors to the memory of those generals who had raised the Roman state from its low origin to the highest pitch of grandeur. He accordingly repaired or rebuilt the public edifices erected by them, preserving the former inscriptions, and placing statues of them all, with triumphal emblems, in both the porticos of his forum, issuing an edict on the occasion, in which he made the following declaration: "My design in so doing is, that the Roman people may require from me, and all succeeding princes, a conformity to those illustrious examples." He likewise removed the statue of Pompey from the Senate House, in which Gaius Caesar had been killed, and placed it under a marble arch, fronting the palace attached to Pompey's theatre. He corrected many ill practices, which, to the detriment of the public, had either survived the licentious habits of the late civil wars, or else originated in the long peace. Bands of robbers showed themselves openly, completely armed, under color of self-defense, and in different parts of the country, travelers, freemen and slaves without distinction, were forcibly carried off, and kept to work in the houses of correction. Several associations were formed under the specious name of a new college, which banded together for the perpetration of all kinds of villainy. The banditti he quelled by establishing posts of soldiers in suitable stations for the purpose. The houses of correction were subjected to a strict superintendence. All associations, those only excepted which were of ancient standing, and recognized by the laws, were dissolved. He burnt all the notes of those who had been a long time in arrear with the treasury, as being the principal source of vexatious suits and prosecutions. Places in the city claimed by the public, where the right was doubtful, he adjudged to the actual possessors. He struck out of the list of criminals the names of those over whom prosecutions had been long impending, where nothing further was intended by the informers than to gratify their own malice, by seeing their enemies humiliated, laying it down as a rule, that if any one chose to renew a prosecution, he should incur the risk of the punishment which he sought to inflict. and that crimes might not escape punishment, nor business be neglected by delay, he ordered the courts to sit during the 30 days which were spent in celebrating honorary games. To the 3 classes of judges then existing, he added a 4th, consisting of persons of inferior order, who were called ducenarii, and decided all litigations about trifling sums. He chose judges from the age of 30 years and upwards, that is 5 years younger than had been usual before. And a great many declining the office, he was with much difficulty prevailed upon to allow each class of judges a 12-months vacation in turn, and the courts to be shut during the months of November and December. He was himself assiduous in his functions as a judge, and would sometimes prolong his sittings even into the night. If he were indisposed, his litter was placed before the tribunal, or he administered justice reclining on his couch at home, displaying always not only the greatest attention, but extreme lenity. To save a culprit, who evidently appeared guilty of parricide, from the extreme penalty of being sewn up in a sack, because none were punished in that manner but such as confessed the fact, he is said to have interrogated him thus: "Surely you did not kill your father, did you?" And when, in a trial of a cause about a forged will, all those who had signed it were liable to the penalty of the Cornelian law, he ordered that his colleagues on the tribunal should not only be furnished with the 2 tablets by which they decided, guilty or not guilty, but with a 3rd likewise, ignoring the offense of those who should appear to have given their signatures through any deception or mistake. All appeals in causes between inhabitants of Rome, he assigned every year to the praetor of the city, and where provincials were concerned, to men of consular rank, to one of whom the business of each province was referred. Some laws he abrogated, and he made some new ones, such as the sumptuary law, that relating to adultery and the violation of chastity, the law against bribery in elections, and likewise that for the encouragement of marriage. Having been more severe in his reform of this law than the rest, he found the people utterly averse to submit to it, unless the penalties were abolished or mitigated, besides allowing an interval of 3 years after a wife's death, and increasing the premiums on marriage. The equestrian order clamoured loudly, at a spectacle in the theatre, for its total repeal, whereupon he sent for the children of Germanicus, and showed them partly sitting upon his own lap, and partly on their father's, intimating by his looks and gestures, that they ought not to think it a grievance to follow the example of that young man. But finding that the force of the law was eluded, by marrying girls under the age of puberty, and by frequent change of wives, he limited the time for consummation after espousals, and imposed restrictions on divorce. By 2 separate scrutinies he reduced to their former number and splendor the Senate, which had been swamped by a disorderly crowd, for they were now more than 1,000, and some of them very mean persons, who, after Caesar's death, had been chosen by dint of interest and bribery, so that they had the nickname of Orsini among the people. The first of these scrutinies was left to themselves, each senator naming another, but the last was conducted by himself and Agrippa. On this occasion he is believed to have taken his seat as he presided, with a coat of mail under his tunic, and a sword by his side, and with 10 of the stoutest men of senatorial rank, who were his friends, standing round his chair. Cordus Cremutius relates that no senator was suffered to approach him, except singly, and after having his bosom searched, for secreted daggers. Some he obliged to have the grace of declining the office, these he allowed to retain the privileges of wearing the distinguishing dress, occupying the seats at the solemn spectacles, and of feasting publicly, reserved to the senatorial order. That those who were chosen and approved of, might perform their functions under more solemn obligations, and with less inconvenience, he ordered that every senator, before he took his seat in the House, should pay his devotions, with an offering of frankincense and wine, at the altar of that God in whose temple the Senate then assembled, and that their stated meetings should be only twice in the month, namely, on the calends and ides, and that in the months of September and October, a certain number only, chosen by lot, such as the law required to give validity to a decree, should be required to attend. For himself, he resolved to choose every 6 months a new council, with whom he might consult previously upon such affairs as he judged proper at any time to lay before the full Senate. He also took the votes of the senators upon any subject of importance, not according to custom, nor in regular order, but as he pleased, that every one might hold himself ready to give his opinion, rather than a mere vote of assent. He also made several other alterations in the management of public affairs, among which were these following: that the acts of the Senate should not be published, that the magistrates should not be sent into the provinces immediately after the expiration of their office, that the proconsuls should have a certain sum assigned them out of the treasury for mules and tents, which used before to be contracted for by the government with private persons, that the management of the treasury should be transferred from the city quaestors to the praetors, or those who had already served in the latter office, and that the decemviri should call together the court of 100, which had been formerly summoned by those who had filled the office of quaestor. To augment the number of persons employed in the administration of the state, he devised several new offices, such as surveyors of the public buildings, of the roads, the aqueducts, and the bed of the Tiber, for the distribution of corn to the people, the prefecture of the city, a triumvirate for the election of the senators, and another for inspecting the several troops of the equestrian order, as often as it was necessary. He revived the office of censor, which had been long disused, and increased the number of praetors. He likewise required that whenever the consulship was conferred on him, he should have 2 colleagues instead of 1, but his proposal was rejected, all the senators declaring by acclamation that he abated his high majesty quite enough in not filling the office alone, and consenting to share it with another. He was unsparing in the reward of military merit, having granted to above 30 generals the honor of the greater triumph, besides which, he took care to have triumphal decorations voted by the Senate for more than that number. That the sons of senators might become early acquainted with the administration of affairs, he permitted them, at the age when they took the garb of manhood, to assume also the distinction of the senatorian robe, with its broad border, and to be present at the debates in the Senate House. When they entered the military service, he not only gave them the rank of military tribunes in the legions, but likewise the command of the auxiliary horse. And that all might have an opportunity of acquiring military experience, he commonly joined 2 sons of senators in command of each troop of horse. He frequently reviewed the troops of the equestrian order, reviving the ancient custom of a cavalcade, which had been long laid aside. But he did not suffer anyone to be obliged by an accuser to dismount while he passed in review, as had formerly been the practice. As for such as were infirm with age, or any way deformed, he allowed them to send their horses before them, coming on foot to answer to their names, when the muster roll was called over soon afterwards. He permitted those who had attained the age of 35 years, and desired not to keep their horse any longer, to have the privilege of giving it up. Thank you for watching.
If you are returning to the Classic Masterworks channel, welcome back. If you are new, please don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the bell notification so that you will be made aware of our latest content.